Hello, friends. Do you think you could survive in the Middle Ages in the times of the Vikings? Well, first listen to the story about the life of an ordinary blacksmith. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, it's important to us. Also write in the comments from which country you are watching this video. So let's go. The fjord still slept beneath a veil of morning mist. The cries of distant gulls drifted faintly through the cold air, mixing with the low hush of the tide slapping against stone. The world was quiet, but inside Thorvald's forge, the embers still whispered softly, holding on to the final breaths of last night's fire. Thorvald woke to the faint smell of smoke and iron. His broad hand reached for the rough woolen blanket, pushing it aside as his boots thudded against the wooden floor. The small, single-room house was dim, lit only by the pale silver glow of dawn seeping through cracks in the shutters. A clay mug stood on the table, half filled with stale mead, next to an untouched crust of bread. He sat up slowly, stretching his shoulders until they popped, grimacing at the familiar ache that never truly left him. His body carried the weight of his craft, years of swinging hammers, lifting iron, bending steel into shape. Every scar, every hardened callus on his palms told a story older than words. Thorvald rose and crossed the small room, splashing his face with icy water from the barrel near the door. The shock jolted him fully awake, and he inhaled deeply, drawing in the sharp scent of salt and pine carried from the nearby forests. Today was like every other day, or so he thought. Thorvald dressed simply, a coarse woolen tunic the color of ash, trousers of thick linen, and a leather apron scored with countless burns. On the table by the door lay his tools, a short knife, a whetstone, and a small bronze amulet shaped like Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor. He touched it briefly, muttering a quiet prayer. "Guide my hands, old God. Let the steel sing true." Stepping outside, Thorvald felt the chill wind slide across his skin, carrying with it the sound of the fjord. Smoke curled lazily from the few other houses in the settlement, and far to the east, the rising sun painted the clouds a deep amber. He entered the forge, and the scent struck him instantly: coal, steel, and the faint sweetness of charred wood. The room was small but alive with purpose. Against the far wall stood racks of hammers, chisels, and tongs, each worn smooth from years of use. Bundles of iron billets leaned against the corner, while on a low shelf rested finished blades wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. The great anvil dominated the center of the room, blackened and scarred like an old warrior's shield. Thorvald knelt by the hearth, pushing dry birch bark beneath the coals. With practiced movements, he struck flint to steel, sending a shower of sparks cascading downward. Soon, flames licked upward, and the forge awoke with a hungry breath. He selected a billet of raw iron, its cold weight familiar in his hands, and placed it into the heart of the fire. As the heat grew, he worked the bellows steadily, feeding the flames until they roared like a living beast. Sparks danced around him, clinging briefly to his leather apron before vanishing into the air. When the metal glowed a deep orange, Thorvald seized it with long tongs and laid it on the anvil. He gripped his hammer, lifted it high, and brought it down. The first strike echoed through the village like distant thunder. The second followed. Then the third. Each blow rang clear and sharp, the sound carrying across the fjord, bouncing between stone and forest. The rhythm was steady, almost ritualistic: strike, turn, strike, turn. The heat rose around him, his muscles tightening and relaxing in a perfect practiced dance. For Thorvald, this was freedom. Here in the forge, he commanded chaos, shaping raw, stubborn ore into blades that would outlive him. By midday, the settlement stirred fully awake. The sound of goats bleating drifted from the pens near the slope, and the voices of children playing mixed with the slap of waves against the shore. Smoke rose from several hearths, carrying the scent of baking bread and drying fish. People began arriving one by one. First came Ragnar the Elder, limping slightly on his old knee, cradling a chipped knife in his hands. "Thorvald," he rasped, setting the blade on the workbench. "This one's seen too many winters. Make it bite again, eh?" Thorvald nodded silently, taking the knife and setting it aside. He was not a man of many words. His craft spoke for him. Next came a young hunter, Bjorn, eager-faced and restless. "I need 6 new arrowheads," he said quickly, leaning on the frame of the doorway. "Elk season's coming." Thorvald simply grunted, acknowledging him, and gestured for the lad to return at sundown. Then, in the afternoon, footsteps heavier than the rest approached. A tall man stood in the doorway, filling it entirely, Einar, a warrior wrapped in a thick bearskin cloak, his beard heavy with frost. His hand rested on the haft of a great axe slung across his back. "Thorvald," he said, his deep voice carrying a weight that silenced even the forge's roar, "the Jarl summons you." Thorvald looked up from the blade he was shaping, sweat dripping down his temple. "For what?" Einar hesitated, studying him with unreadable eyes. "The southern shores," he said finally. "Rich lands, weak defenses. The Jarl wants warriors and your hands on the march." Thorvald paused, setting the blade aside. It had been 5 winters since his last raid, 5 long years of peace, steel, and solitude. His heart longed to stay by the forge, where life was simple, where he ruled fire and iron. But refusing the Jarl's call, that was no choice at all. By sundown, the last embers glowed faintly in the forge. Thorvald quenched the day's final blade in a barrel of cold water, steam rising in twisting, ghost-like tendrils. He leaned against the anvil, his chest rising and falling heavily, listening to the fading sounds of the village as night gathered. Children were called home, animals penned, and torches lit along the narrow paths. Thorvald's hands were blackened with soot, his body aching, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over Einar's words, tasting the promise of war like iron on his tongue. The days of quiet would soon end. The hammer would rest, and Thorvald would once again take up the sword. The morning mist still clung to the fjord when Thorvald stepped outside his forge, the heavy leather apron hanging loosely over his broad shoulders. The air carried a sharp bite of salt and pine, and the cries of distant gulls echoed above the low rumble of waves breaking on the rocky shore. He'd barely slept. The words from yesterday still echoed in his mind. "The Jarl summons you." For 5 winters, Thorvald's life had been simple: fire, steel, and the steady rhythm of hammer on iron. Now the tide was turning, and he knew there would be no going back. Thorvald followed the narrow dirt trail that wound uphill toward the Jarl's longhouse. The path cut between rows of modest wooden huts, their thatched roofs slick with dew. Thin threads of smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the smell of drying fish and peat fires. People were awake now. Women bent over washing tubs, their hands red from icy water, while children chased each other barefoot through the damp grass, their laughter sharp and bright against the quiet morning. Hunters stood by the pens sharpening their arrows, murmuring low to one another about omens and storms. As Thorvald passed, voices hushed. Some nodded respectfully, others watched him in silence. Being the settlement's blacksmith carried its weight. His weapons had armed most of the warriors who'd never returned from past raids. Men whispered of luck, of curses, of the iron he shaped as though it carried fragments of the god's will. At the crest of the hill, the longhouse came into view, a massive timber structure, dark against the pale gray sky. Smoke poured steadily from the central vent, and the carved dragon heads at each corner glistened with dew, their wooden teeth bared as if warning the world below. Thorvald paused briefly at the threshold, listening to the deep hum of voices inside, the steady beat of a single drum somewhere beyond the door. He took a long breath and stepped forward. The warmth hit him first, a heavy, smoky heat from the long central hearth, where flames licked high around blackened logs. The smell of burning pine mixed with roasted meat, spilled mead, and sweat. Shadows flickered across the carved beams overhead, where old shields and wolf pelts hung as trophies. Benches lined either side of the hall, crowded with warriors, traders, and hunters. Most wore bearskins or heavy cloaks, axes resting across their knees, voices hushed beneath the low roar of fire. At the far end of the hall sat Jarl Stenvar, broad-shouldered and fierce-eyed, his gray-streaked beard braided into two thick ropes. He leaned forward on his carved oak throne, his hands resting on the pommel of a sword older than Thorvald himself. Einar stood near the Jarl's right hand, silent and watchful. When Thorvald entered, his gaze flicked up briefly, a look not of greeting but acknowledgement, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Thorvald Ironhand," the Jarl's deep voice rolled through the hall, cutting through murmurs and crackling flames. "Step forward." Thorvald obeyed, boots echoing on the wooden floor as all eyes turned toward him. "You've heard why I summoned you," Jarl Stenvar said, his voice carrying the weight of authority sharpened by age and battle. "South of here, beyond the Whale Road, lies a land fat with silver, grain, and slaves. The settlements are small, their walls weak." He gestured to the warriors seated on the benches. "We've waded through 5 winters, rebuilding our strength, forging steel, mending ships. Now the omens are clear. The All-Father sends us a wind for victory." Thorvald shifted his weight, his broad hand resting against his belt where his smithing knife hung. He wanted to speak but held his tongue. The hall waited. "You've armed my men for many seasons," the Jarl continued. "Your blades have drunk from rivers of Saxon blood. Now it is time you carry one into battle yourself." The words landed like a hammer on the anvil. Thorvald bowed his head slightly, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "As you command, Jarl Stenvar." A murmur ran through the benches, half approval, half unease. The blacksmith joining the raid was no small thing. His absence from the forge meant fewer weapons, fewer repairs. But the Jarl's word was law. Stenvar gestured for him to approach the great oak table at the center of the hall. Laid across it was a rough map carved into tanned hide, its edges weighted down with polished stones. Small carved figures marked ships, forts, and known villages. Einar pointed to a jagged coastline drawn in dark ink. "We sail here," he said, his voice low but firm. 4 days south across the Whale Road, 3 ships, 50 men each." Thorvald studied the map in silence, tracing the black lines that marked rivers and forests he'd never seen. Einar's finger shifted to a circle inked near the coastline. "This settlement, unguarded except for a wooden palisade. They'll not withstand a proper assault." Murmurs rose around the table, some hungry with anticipation, others edged with caution. One of the older warriors, Halfdan, spat into the firelight. "Every easy raid smells of traps," he growled. The Jarl silenced him with a single glance. "The gods favor the bold," Stenvar said simply, his voice hard as forged steel. After the council ended, the Jarl called Thorvald aside near the great hearth. "You are more than a warrior to me," Stenvar said quietly, his voice meant only for him. "You'll fight, yes, but your hands will shape our survival. I want your tools, your skill, your forge fire aboard the ship. A broken axe in battle kills more men than an enemy blade." Thorvald nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a raid. This was a test of every hammer stroke he had ever made. By the time Thorvald left the longhouse, dusk had fallen across the fjord. Torches burned along the winding paths, their flames dancing wildly in the growing wind. Warriors moved between houses carrying bundles of spears, shields, and bundles of dried fish. Women tended fires, patching cloaks and mending sails. Thorvald walked slowly back toward his forge, his boots sinking into damp earth. His mind was restless, pulled between duty and dread. The forge had been his sanctuary, the place where he controlled the chaos of the world by shaping it into steel. Soon, that sanctuary would be left cold and silent. As he opened the door, the familiar smell of iron and ash wrapped around him like an old friend. He set down his leather gloves on the workbench and stared at the weapons hanging on the wall. Each one bore his mark. Each one would soon drink blood. Tomorrow, preparations would begin in earnest. Tomorrow, the blacksmith would become a warrior once more. The night passed without sleep. Thorvald lay on the wooden bench in his small house, staring at the ceiling as the forge's dying embers glimmered faintly in the corner. His mind churned like storm-driven waves. For years, his days had been shaped by steady rhythm, fire, steel, and silence. But now the order of his world was breaking, replaced by chaos and uncertainty. When the first pale light of dawn crept across the fjord, he rose. Outside, the wind carried the faint cry of ravens, and Thorvald muttered an old prayer under his breath. Odin, guide my hands. By the time the sun edged above the horizon, the forge roared with life. Flames licked the stone hearth, glowing coals spat sparks into the air, and the ringing of steel carried over the village. Thorvald stripped to his tunic, sweat darkening the fabric almost immediately, as his hammer came down in a relentless rhythm. On the workbench lay rows of unfinished spearheads, axe blades, and seek's knives, each one destined for blood. Some were for the younger warriors who had little of their own. Others belonged to seasoned fighters, men whose weapons had been battered and chipped by countless raids. Einar arrived early, leaning his tall frame against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You'll wear yourself to the bone," he said, nodding toward the red-hot billet on the anvil. Thorvald didn't look up. "Better I do it here than on the field." A small smile tugged at the corner of Einar's mouth. "Don't think you'll escape the field, blacksmith." Thorvald quenched the glowing spearhead in water, steam hissing violently. "I know," he muttered, gripping his hammer tighter. By midday, the entire settlement was alive with purpose. Down by the shore, 3 longships rested in shallow water, their carved dragon-headed prows glaring across the fjord. Men worked in teams, dragging bundles of oak planks, hammering fresh nails and patching torn sails. Children ran along the beach, carrying buckets of tar to seal the hulls, while older women stitched linen sails, their needles flashing in the sunlight. The smell of pine resin, sea salt, and burning pitch mixed into a single sharp taste in the air. Thorvald made several trips between his forge and the beach, hauling armfuls of spear shafts, bags of rivets, and leather bindings. His tools, once dedicated only to shaping steel, now mended shields and reinforced hulls. The rhythm of the village had shifted. The entire settlement was a single living organism, preparing to strike. On the high meadow near the edge of the forest, the warriors gathered. The ground trembled with the force of their sparring wooden shields slamming together, axes whistling through the air, grunts and roars rising like thunder. Thorvald paused briefly as he passed, watching Einar clash with Halfdan, the gray-bearded veteran of many raids. The 2 men circled, shields raised, their movements deliberate and precise. When Halfdan lunged, Einar caught the blow with his shield, pivoted, and slammed his shoulder into the older man's chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The crowd roared with approval, but Thorvald saw no glory in it. These were his friends, his neighbors, his kin, and in a few days many of them would be nothing but names whispered into the night. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the fjord in hues of amber and crimson, Thorvald's muscles burned with exhaustion. His hands were blackened from soot, his knuckles raw, but the racks of weapons were full at last. 20 spears, 15 axes, 8 longswords, and dozens of seek's knives. Each blade bore his mark, a simple rune hammered deep into the steel, a silent promise of strength. Einar came by again at dusk, his shadow stretching long against the glow of the forge. "The Jarl will feast tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we bless the ships, be ready." Thorvald nodded without lifting his gaze from the anvil. "I'll be there." When Einar left, Thorvald stayed alone by the forge, staring at the weapons hanging along the walls. Each one was more than metal. Each one was fate. Later, when darkness blanketed the fjord and the first stars blinked awake, Thorvald stood outside, staring across the still black water. The longships bobbed gently at their moorings, their dragon prows seeming to watch the horizon with unblinking eyes. Behind him, the forge cooled. Tomorrow, his sanctuary would fall silent. He clenched his fists, the rough scars on his palms catching the starlight, and whispered into the wind, "Let me return to this fire." The first light of dawn spilled over the fjord like molten silver, glinting off the calm black waters. A cold mist clung to the ground, winding between the wooden houses and creeping up the slopes, veiling the shore in shifting shadows. Thorvald awoke to the distant echo of drums. A slow, steady rhythm, thum, 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 carried through the village, calling every man, woman, and child to the beach. Today, the ships would be blessed, and the gods would be asked to guide their journey. By the time Thorvald reached the beach, the settlement had already gathered. Hundreds stood along the shoreline, warriors in polished mail, hunters in wolf pelts, old men leaning on carved staves, women holding the hands of wide-eyed children. The entire village had come to witness the ritual. 3 longships rested on the sand, their prows carved into snarling dragon heads, teeth bared toward the open sea. The fresh tar on their hulls glistened in the pale morning light, and coils of hemp rope hung neatly from their sides. Warriors moved among them, fastening shields to the rails and stacking bundles of spears and axes. The air was thick with the smells of pine resin, salt, and burning pitch. Above it all drifted the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic voices rising from the gathered Gothite priests, who stood barefoot on the damp sand, their faces painted with spirals of white ash and soot. Thorvald stood beside Einar, arms crossed over his chest, silent as the drums faded. "You've done good work," Einar murmured, nodding at the rows of weapons Thorvald had forged. "Every man carries your steel." Thorvald's gaze remained fixed on the ships. "Then let the gods make it strong." At the center of the beach, before the 3 longships, stood Jarl Stenvar. He wore a crimson cloak pinned with a silver brooch shaped like Thor's hammer. A great drinking horn, gilded and etched with runes, rested in his hand. He raised it high, and the beach fell silent. "Hear me, Allfather," the Jarl's voice thundered across the water carried by the wind. "We call upon you, Odin One-Eye, giver of victory, taker of the slain. Guide us across the whale road." The Gothite priests raised their arms, chanting in unison, their voices merging with the rush of the tide. "Odin Valfurther, guide us. Thor, protector of Midgard, guard us. Freyja, bless our harvest of silver and souls." A white goat was led forward, its horns gilded and its coat washed clean. The priests murmured words older than memory before drawing a Sikh's knife across its throat. Blood poured into a carved wooden bowl, steaming faintly in the chill air. With a sprig of evergreen dipped in the bowl, the chief priest blotted the longships, splattering crimson drops across the carved dragon heads. The warriors stood in silence, their faces set, their breaths fogging in the cold. Thorvald felt the weight of the moment press on his chest. He'd seen battles before, seen death and fire, but the ceremony reminded him of something deeper, that their lives were threads woven by unseen hands, pulled toward fates they could neither resist nor understand. When the blessing ended, the villagers climbed the hill to the longhouse, where the Jarl had prepared a feast for the chosen warriors. The hall glowed with torchlight, shadows dancing across the carved wooden beams. Boars roasted over open fires, their skins blistered and crackling. The air was heavy with the smells of smoked fish, spiced mead, and pine smoke. Thorvald sat among the other warriors on the rough wooden benches. Einar, Halfdan, and several younger men filled the air with bold boasts. Who would take the most silver? Who would drink the most mead? Who would fall first? Thorvald remained silent, staring into his horn of ale, lost in thought. Across the hall, Jarl Stenvar stood and raised his drinking horn again. "Tomorrow, we sail the whale road," he bellowed, his voice booming over the roar of voices. "We take what the weak cannot defend, and when we return, our names will be sung in the halls of our fathers." The warriors cheered, pounding their fists against the tables, the sound like distant thunder rolling through the hall. Later, as the feast wore on and the mead dulled the edges of fear, Thorvald stepped outside into the cold night air. The fjord stretched before him, black and endless beneath a canopy of stars. He listened to the waves lapping against the shore and the faint creak of moored ships rocking in the tide. The dragon-headed longships stood silent now, their shadows stretching long across the sand, patient as predators waiting to strike. Einar joined him quietly, handing him a horn of watered mead. "You're quiet," he said. Thorvald sipped, saying nothing. "You're thinking about the forge," Einar guessed. Thorvald finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "I'm thinking about the dead." Einar nodded, his expression unreadable in the starlight. Then think of this: every weapon you've forged will send an enemy there before it sends one of us. That's the gift you've given us, Thorvald. Thorvald didn't answer, but he gripped the horn tighter, his knuckles whitening. Before the feast ended, the warriors gathered outside the longhouse beneath the northern lights, which shimmered faintly across the horizon like green fire. Each man placed a hand on his weapon, and Jarl Stenvar led them in the oath. By the gods we swear, by blood and by steel, we will return with silver and glory, or not return at all. Thorvald whispered the words with the others, the weight of them sinking deep into his chest. Tomorrow there would be no turning back. The cold gray light of dawn broke over the fjord, spreading across the black surface of the water like molten silver. A thin mist clung low to the waves, curling around the three dragon-prowed longships resting silently at the shore. The carved heads of beasts, dragons, wolves, and serpents, glared into the horizon as though daring the gods themselves to test their strength. Thorvald stood on the wet sand, his boots sinking slightly into the dark earth. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the sharp taste of salt and pine resin from the tarred hulls. Today, the forge was silent. Today, he was no longer a blacksmith. He was a warrior. The settlement gathered to watch them leave. Families stood close together, wrapped in cloaks against the cold, their faces solemn beneath the pale morning light. Mothers held small children tight, and old men leaned on staffs carved with ancient runes, muttering quiet prayers to the gods. Thorvald spotted Ragnar the elder among them, his lined face pale as bone. The old man raised a trembling hand in silent blessing, and Thorvald nodded back once, his throat too tight for words. At the shoreline, Jarl Stenvar barked commands, his voice cutting through the sea breeze. Load the last barrels, check the sails, shields to the rails. Warriors moved quickly, hoisting bundles of dried fish, skins of mead, and chests of iron spearheads onto the ships. Wooden shields were strapped in neat rows along the rails, their painted surfaces glinting faintly in the light. Einar approached Thorvald, his cloak snapping in the wind. "You ready for this?" he asked, adjusting the leather straps of his mail shirt. Thorvald tightened the grip on his Seek's knife. "No," he admitted quietly, "but I'll go anyway." Einar grinned, clapping him hard on the shoulder. "That's all the gods ask of us." With a sharp blast of the horn, the men shoved the longships into the tide. Water surged around their boots, icy and numbing, as they heaved the heavy hulls forward until the sea swallowed them. One by one, the warriors clambered aboard, taking their places at the oars. Thorvald sat midway down the ship, the long ash oar smooth beneath his calloused hands. The muscles in his arms burned as he drove the blade into the water, pulling in rhythm with the others. The sound of creaking wood, splashing waves, and grunts of exertion merged into a single steady heartbeat. The dragon-headed longships slid swiftly from the shallows, cutting through the mist like silent predators. Behind them, the village shrank into a smudge of smoke and timber, swallowed by distance and haze. Thorvald turned once, watching the forge roof disappear beyond the headland. For a brief moment, doubt gnawed at him like a hungry wolf. Will I ever return? By midday, the coastline faded, replaced by the endless expanse of the open ocean. The horizon stretched unbroken, sky and water merging into a single shifting mirror of gray and silver. The men rowed in silence, their breath steaming in the cold air. After hours of labor, Stenvar finally gave the order, and the sail was unfurled. The linen caught the sharp northern wind, snapping loudly as it billowed wide. The oars were shipped, and the longship surged forward, cutting through the water with renewed speed. Thorvald leaned back against the side, flexing aching fingers as he studied the faces around him. Young Bjorn, barely 16 winters old, rubbed his blistered palms raw but said nothing, determined to hide his pain. Halfdan, the grizzled veteran, sat with his eyes closed, lips moving silently, whispering to the gods, or perhaps to the dead. Einar sat cross-legged near the prow, carving runes into the wooden shaft of his spear. "What are you writing?" Thorvald asked, breaking the silence. Einar didn't look up. "A promise," he said simply, "to take what is owed." By the second night, the sea had changed. The once gentle waves grew restless, slapping hard against the hull, spraying cold salt water into the faces of the oarsmen. Dark clouds rolled low and heavy across the horizon, swallowing the pale stars. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sharp tang of an approaching storm. Jarl Stenvar stood at the stern, his hand gripping the tiller, his voice booming over the crash of the surf. "Secure the sail, lash the oars. Thor tests us tonight." Thorvald and the others moved quickly, tying ropes tight, checking knots and stacking spare shields against the rails. The first gusts hit soon after, rocking the longship as the prow rose and fell violently over growing swells. Thunder rolled across the heavens like distant war drums, and lightning flashed briefly on the horizon, illuminating the dragon prows of the other ships cutting through the turbulent black waters. Thorvald whispered a prayer beneath his breath, his voice lost to the wind. By dawn, the storm passed as swiftly as it came, leaving the sea strangely calm. Steam rose from the men's soaked cloaks as the pale sun broke weakly through thinning clouds. The longships floated quietly, sails slack, the silence broken only by the distant call of seabirds. Thorvald breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the sharp, salty air. For the first time since they'd left the fjord, he felt something stir beneath his unease, a strange exhilaration, wild and primal. The whale road stretched endlessly before them, but now, for the first time, Thorvald understood why men followed it into unknown lands. By midday, shouts erupted from the prow. "Land! Land ahead!" Thorvald rose, shading his eyes against the glare of the water. Far ahead, a dark smudge broke the horizon, cliffs rising above the surf, crowned by dense green forests. Beyond them, faint smoke curled from unseen settlements. The men murmured among themselves, voices low with anticipation and fear. Spears and axes were checked, shields tightened, blades drawn from leather sheaths and kissed for luck. Einar stood beside Thorvald, his jaw set. "Soon," he said quietly. Thorvald nodded once, fingers tightening around the hilt of his seeks. For now the sea was behind them. Ahead lay fire, blood, and fate. The morning sun broke through thin clouds, spilling pale light across the restless sea. The longships drifted silently now, their sails furled, moving on the power of the oars alone. The air carried a sharp tang of salt and damp wood, and somewhere far off, gulls screamed over the sound of crashing waves. Thorvald sat near the middle of the ship, his rough hands gripping the smooth ash handle of his oar, sweat already slicking his palms despite the morning chill. Ahead of them, the coastline rose, dark cliffs crowned by thick green forests and dotted with small thatched rooftops. Thin streams of smoke curled into the pale sky, betraying the presence of life. Beside him, Einar leaned forward, watching the shore intently. "Almost there," he murmured. Thorvald nodded but said nothing, his throat tight. His heart beat like a drum in his chest, faster than the measured rhythm of the oars. The Jarl stood at the stern, his crimson cloak snapping in the wind, his voice low but sharp as a drawn blade. "Quiet now. No shouting. No horns. Let them wake to fire and steel." The men nodded grimly, their expressions carved from stone. Spears were checked, blades drawn and kissed for luck, shields gripped tighter. The clatter of gear ceased. The only sound was the creak of the hull and the steady splash of oars. Thorvald glanced at his weapons laid carefully at his feet. A hand-forged seax with a bone handle, a light axe etched with runes, and a round wooden shield painted in faded black and crimson. He had made them all himself, but holding them now, they felt heavier than he remembered. Young Bjorn, seated nearby, trembled slightly, his knuckles white on the shaft of his spear. Thorvald rested a hand briefly on his shoulder, saying nothing. The boy gave a tight nod, swallowing hard. The coastline grew clearer. A small settlement sprawled near the edge of the forest, wooden fences encircling a cluster of huts. Chickens pecked in the dirt near the gates. Thin smoke curled lazily from hearth fires. They had no idea death was coming. The longship slid into the shallows with barely a splash. Warriors leapt over the rails, boots sinking into cold, wet sand, shields slung across their backs. The smell of seaweed mixed with the faint sweetness of wildflowers drifting from the forest beyond. Thorvald waded ashore, the water soaking his trousers up to the knees. The ground was soft beneath his boots, scattered with smooth black stones glistening under the sun. He crouched low, moving in silence with the others as they fanned out along the beach. Einar raised his hand, signaling the advance. 50 men crept through the high grass toward the wooden palisade. The sound of their breathing was heavy but hushed, the only other noise the distant crash of waves. Thorvald could feel his own pulse pounding in his ears, each step bringing him closer to the gates. They were halfway to the settlement when the first shout went up. A boy tending goats on the hillside spotted the approaching warriors and screamed, bolting for the village. His voice carried like an arrow. "Forward!" Stenvar roared, his deep voice breaking the silence. "No retreat!" The warriors broke into a run, shields raised, axes and swords flashing in the morning light. Arrows began to whistle from the palisade, hissing like angry serpents. One struck the sand near Thorvald's boot. Another thudded into a nearby shield with a dull, splintering crack. Einar surged ahead, bellowing, his heavy axe cleaving the first wooden gate post clean through. Thorvald rushed beside him, raising his shield to catch a second arrow as they reached the wall. With a single mighty shove, the warriors burst through the flimsy gate, and chaos consumed the settlement. The first scream Thorvald heard was raw and unearthly, a sound that tore through the air like ripping cloth. The clash of steel followed instantly, the ring of blades, the crunch of splintered shields, the guttural roar of men meeting death head-on. Thorvald fought close and low, using his axe in one hand and his seeks in the other. A man lunged at him with a spear. Thorvald caught it on his shield, twisting hard before driving his blade into the man's exposed ribs. Hot blood sprayed across his arm, and for a brief second the world narrowed to hammering heartbeats and the hiss of his own breath. Beside him, Einar moved like a storm, his heavy axe cleaving shields and skulls alike, roaring as though each strike was an offering to Odin himself. Young Bjorn fought behind them, pale but unyielding, driving his spear through the thigh of a man twice his size. "Shields, to me!" Jarl Stenvar's voice cut through the din. Thorvald and the others closed ranks, forming a rough wall of round shields. Arrows clattered harmlessly off their fronts as they pressed forward step by brutal step, driving the defenders back toward the central hall. A torch flew, landing on the thatched roof of a hut. Flames leapt hungrily, racing across dry straw as thick black smoke coiled upward into the sky. Within minutes, half the settlement burned. The screams of terrified villagers mingled with the roar of warriors and the crackle of fire. Chickens scattered wildly, goats bleated, and the acrid stench of burning pitch and flesh thickened the air. Thorvald stumbled briefly as his boot slipped on blood-slick earth, catching himself on his shield. He turned sharply, parrying a sword swing and countering with a brutal strike to the man's jaw, sending him crumpling into the dirt. The defenders fought fiercely, but they were few, untrained and ill-equipped. One by one, they fell beneath the advancing tide of steel and fire. It was over quickly. The last of the defenders lay sprawled in the mud, their weapons scattered around them. Smoke hung low, stinging the eyes, and the crackle of burning rooftops filled the silence where screams had been moments before. Thorvald leaned against his shield, chest heaving, sweat mixing with soot and blood on his face. His arms trembled from exhaustion, his axe slick and heavy in his hand. Einar stood nearby, his cloak torn, his beard matted with blood not his own. "You fought well," he said quietly, clapping Thorvald's shoulder. Thorvald didn't answer. His gaze swept the burning settlement, his jaw clenched tight. Among the wreckage, he saw a small wooden toy half buried in the dirt, a carved horse, splintered down the middle. He picked it up slowly, turning it in his hand, then set it gently back in the mud. Jarl Stenvar stood atop the steps of the central hall, his crimson cloak billowing in the smoke-filled wind. "This is only the beginning," he declared, his voice carrying over the ruin. "Tonight we feast. Tomorrow we take more." The The warriors cheered, raising their bloodied weapons into the air. But Thorvald remained silent, his gaze fixed on the rising smoke curling into the pale sky. For the first time since leaving the forge, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. War was no longer a distant story. It was in his hands now. It was in the fire. The sun dipped below the distant cliffs, staining the horizon with deep shades of amber and crimson. Smoke still curled from the blackened rooftops of the conquered settlement, drifting like ghostly banners into the cooling evening air. The cries of gulls had faded, replaced by the low murmur of voices, the crackle of fire, and the distant rhythm of drums. The battle was over, but the night had just begun. Thorvald sat on a rough wooden bench outside the central hall, staring into the dying embers of a small fire. His hands were blackened with soot, streaked with dried blood, some his, some not. His axe rested at his feet, still stained dark despite 2 attempts to clean it. From the beach came the sound of warriors laughing, shouting and singing as they unloaded crates of silver, barrels of mead, and bundles of furs from the longships. The victory feast was beginning. Inside the central hall, Jarl Stenvar presided over the division of the spoils. The long, heavy tables were cluttered with treasures taken from the burning settlement. Silver cups, carved figurines, finely woven cloth, and weapons stripped from fallen defenders. The Jarl's voice rang out above the din. "By blood and by oath, we share what we've won." Warriors stepped forward in turn, their names called aloud. Each handed a portion, a pouch of silver, a new blade, or a length of foreign silk. The larger shares went to the Jarl's sworn men and those who had distinguished themselves in the fight. Einar received a silver-chased axe, its handle engraved with spiraling knotwork. Halfdan claimed a gold ring heavy enough to feed his family for a year. Thorvald, when called, approached slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The Jarl placed a small pouch of silver in his hand and nodded once. "You've earned this, blacksmith," Stenvar said. "Steel and blood both served us well today." Thorvald bowed his head slightly and stepped aside without a word. As night fell, great fires were lit along the beach, their flames throwing dancing shadows across the sand. Boars turned slowly on spits, fat sizzling and dripping into the fire, sending up clouds of fragrant smoke. Barrels of mead were cracked open, and horns passed from hand to hand. Songs rose into the night, harsh, booming voices singing of Odin's wisdom, Thor's strength, and the fate of those who die with a weapon in hand. The rhythm of the drums merged with the crash of the surf, filling the air with a wild, untamed energy. Thorvald sat near the edge of the gathering, his back to one of the longships. Einar dropped down beside him, sloshing mead from his horn as he grinned. "You're too quiet again," Einar said, wiping his beard with the back of his hand. "Drink, Thorvald, tonight we're kings." Thorvald took the offered horn, sipped once, and set it aside. "I'll drink when the forge fire warms my hands again," he muttered. Einar laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "You'll warm them soon enough, with Saxon gold, no less." Near the central fire, the Gothe priests prepared the evening's offerings. A carved wooden idol of Odin stood tall, its single eye painted black and its surface blackened from years of smoke. The priests circled it slowly, chanting low and rhythmic, throwing handfuls of grain and splashes of mead into the fire. The warriors gathered, lowering their voices as the ritual began. "Odin One-Eye Allfather, guide us," the chief Gotha intoned, lifting his arms to the night sky. "Thor, son of Jord, give us strength. Freyja, bless our path with fortune and song." The chanting deepened, merging with the drumbeats until it became one pulse, one breath, one heartbeat for the entire gathering. Thorvald stood among the others, his hand resting on the head of his axe. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for victory, but for return. When the ritual ended, the warriors returned to their feasting and songs, but Thorvald wandered away from the fire, climbing a small rise beyond the edge of the settlement. From there, he could see the entire bay spread before him, the longships rocking gently in the pale moonlight. The night air was sharp with salt and smoke, carrying with it the distant cries of seabirds and the occasional crackle of burning wood. Thorvald's gaze lingered on the forge tools he'd brought aboard the longship, now stacked neatly beside bundles of spare weapons. He thought of the stillness of his forge back home, of the glow of the coals, the rhythm of the hammer, the smell of hot iron and oil. That life seemed so far away now, as if it belonged to another man. Einar found him there, his boots crunching softly on the rocky ground. "Brooding again?" he asked, handing Thorvald another horn. Thorvald shook his head slowly. "Just remembering." "Don't," Einar said simply. "Tomorrow we sail further south. There'll be more battles, more silver. Keep your thoughts on what's ahead, not behind." Thorvald didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering far beyond the moonlit waters. As Thorvald stood there, two ravens wheeled silently overhead, their black wings cutting sharp lines across the stars. One dipped low, gliding just above the fires before vanishing into the forest. The Gothai noticed them too. "Hugin and Munin," he whispered reverently, "Odin's ravens, thought and memory." Thorvald watched them disappear into the night, a strange unease coiling in his gut. He remembered an old saying his father once told him: "When the ravens fly west, the gods are watching." He clenched his fists, the leather of his gloves creaking softly. The fires burned low as the night stretched on. Warriors slumped where they sat, drunk on mead and victory, their songs giving way to heavy snores. The surf whispered against the shore, and the longships rocked gently at their moorings. Thorvald lay awake beneath the stars, his cloak pulled tight against the chill. Sleep came slowly, broken by the sound of distant thunder rolling beyond the horizon. Tomorrow, the Jarl would lead them deeper into foreign lands. Tomorrow, blood would flow again. And Thorvald, the blacksmith who had once shaped steel for others, would shape his own fate upon the edge of his blade. The dawn broke pale and cold over the southern shore. A thin mist rolled across the scorched settlement, weaving through the charred remains of thatched roofs and blackened beams. Smoke still rose in slow, twisting columns, carrying the bitter stench of ash and burnt wood out over the quiet sea. Thorvald stood by the water's edge, fastening the leather straps of his armor. His seeks hung at his hip, his axe at his back, and his round shield rested against his knee. Behind him, warriors moved in silence, their voices hushed, their faces shadowed beneath their hoods and helmets. The night's feast was over. The fires had burned down. Now came the march inland. Jarl Stenvar gathered the men at the edge of the forest, his crimson cloak whipping in the cold breeze. 3 days inland, he said, his deep voice carrying through the mist. The scouts say there's a larger settlement past the hills, a strong one. We'll strike before they can gather allies. The warriors shifted uneasily. A few muttered short prayers beneath their breath, touching the hilts of their blades for luck. Thorvald glanced at Einar, who met his gaze briefly and nodded once as silent reassurance, steady as an anchor in restless waters. They left the shore behind. The path cut upward into a dense wall of trees, the forest stretching high overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast. Shafts of pale light pierced the canopy, painting shifting patterns across the damp earth. The air smelled of moss and wet bark, rich and heavy after the salt-stung winds of the coast. Thorvald's boots sank into soft soil, and each step stirred the sharp tang of pine needles beneath his feet. The forest swallowed them whole. It was silent here, unnervingly so. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals. Only the low crunch of boots and the creak of leather straps as 50 warriors threaded their way between towering trunks. Thorvald felt the weight of the silence pressing on his chest. His hand brushed against the edge of his shield as his gaze swept the shadows between the trees. Einar walked at his side, scanning the path ahead. "This wood has a name," Einar murmured softly. Thorvald raised a brow. "A name? The locals call it Ulfvedr," Einar replied. "Wolf's Wood." Thorvald's frown deepened. "Because of wolves?" Einar shook his head slowly. "Not the four-legged kind." Before Thorvald could respond, the scouts returned, 2 lean warriors moving swiftly and silently between the trees. "No tracks," one said, keeping his voice low. "No villages, but there are signs someone's watching us." They found the bodies at midday. 2 men lay sprawled in the moss, their throats cut clean, their shields splintered. They wore simple woolen tunics, hunters perhaps, but the way their wounds were made spoke of trained hands. Halfdan knelt beside them, his gray beard brushing the damp earth. He traced the cuts with a scarred finger and spat into the dirt. "Not peasants," he muttered. "Scouts. Someone knows we're here." Jarl Stenvar's jaw tightened. "Then we move faster." They pushed deeper into the forest, shields raised now, spears held low. The silence grew heavier, thick enough to feel against the skin. Thorvald's knuckles whitened around his axe, his eyes darting constantly to the shifting shadows. The first arrow came without warning. It struck the shield of a man 2 paces ahead, splintering with a sharp crack. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, a hail of arrows rained down from the trees. "Shields! Shields!" Stenvar roared. The warriors slammed together, forming a rough circle, round shields locking edge to edge as arrows thudded into the wood with dull, heavy sounds. Thorvald crouched low behind his shield, the force of each impact jarring his arm. Einar cursed beside him, peering through a narrow gap in the formation. "I see them! In the trees!" Dark shapes darted among the branches, bows flashing in the pale light. The locals were fast, faster than Thorvald expected, appearing and vanishing like ghosts between the trunks. "Forward!" the Jarl roared, his voice raw over the din. "Push to the clearing!" With shields raised, the warriors surged ahead, boots pounding damp earth, forcing their way through the narrow path. The clash came suddenly when the locals charged, screaming war cries in a tongue Thorvald didn't understand. Steel met steel. Thorvald's axe connected with a man's shoulder, splintering bone beneath wool and leather. He twisted sharply, pulling his weapon free, then blocked a downward strike with his shield, the wood shuddering from the force. Einar roared beside him, swinging his spear low to hook an enemy's legs, sending the man crashing to the ground. Halfdan slammed his shield into another attacker, following with a brutal thrust of his sword. It was quick, messy. Blood sprayed the moss, staining it deep crimson, and the damp earth sucked greedily at it. When the last defender fell, silence reclaimed the forest. The warriors regrouped, panting hard, sweat streaking their faces despite the cold. 4 of their own were dead, 6 wounded, and the Jarl's expression was carved from granite. "They're testing us," Einar said darkly, wiping his blade on his cloak. Thorvald nodded slowly, chest still heaving. "Scouts again." "Or bait," Halfdan growled, his gray eyes narrowing at the dense forest around them. Thorvald glanced upward. High above, 2 ravens wheeled silently between the treetops, circling the battlefield before vanishing deeper into the wood. He remembered the Gothai's whisper during the feast. "When the ravens fly west, the gods are watching." The hair on his neck prickled. By dusk, they reached a small clearing and set camp. Fires were lit carefully, kept low to avoid drawing more attention. The wounded were treated with poultices of pine resin and moss. Shields were repaired where arrows had bitten deep into the wood. Thorvald sat by one of the fires, sharpening his seeks with slow, steady strokes. The edge caught the faint light and glimmered like cold water under moonlight. Einar lowered himself beside him, chewing on a strip of dried meat. "Tomorrow," he said, "we leave the Wolf's Wood behind. The settlement isn't far now." Thorvald didn't look up. "And if more of them are waiting," Einar shrugged, his smile thin and tired, "then we kill them." Thorvald turned the blade in his hand, watching his own reflection ripple in the steel. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, low, mournful, and close enough to carry on the cold night air. The sun rose pale and cold above the forest as the warriors broke camp. A thin frost coated the leaves, crunching softly under their boots as they marched in silence. The mist hung low, trailing ghost-like tendrils between the trunks, carrying with it the damp scent of moss and earth. Thorvald walked beside Einar near the front, his round shield strapped tightly to his back, his axe hanging at his side. His breath steamed faintly in the chill morning air, each exhale twisting into silver threads before vanishing into nothingness. Ahead of them the scouts moved like shadows, slipping silently between the trees, When they returned, their news spread quickly through the ranks. "Stone walls," one whispered, his voice low and tense. "High ones, and a palisade beyond." Jarl Stenvar raised his hand, halting the march. His voice was steady but heavy, carrying the weight of what lay ahead. "This is no village. This is a stronghold. Eldhalo. If we take it, the south opens before us. If we fail," his gaze swept across the warriors, "we die here." No one spoke. There was nothing to say. By midday, the trees thinned and the warriors emerged onto a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Below lay Eldhalo, a fortified settlement perched on the curve of a river, its high palisade reinforced with stone at the base. Smoke curled from dozens of rooftops inside, and beyond the walls, fields of winter grain stretched across the plain. The wooden gates were barred, the walkways lined with men carrying bows and spears. Bright painted shields hung along the walls, sunlight glinting faintly off their iron rims. Thorvald inhaled deeply, the cold air sharp in his lungs. He could hear the distant sounds from within the settlement, the ring of steel on steel, the bleating of penned goats, the faint calls of women shepherding children to safety. Einar leaned on his spear, studying the walls carefully. "This won't be easy," he muttered. Thorvald nodded silently, his stomach twisting with unease. The warriors gathered at the foot of the ridge as Jarl Stenvar knelt over a rough map drawn in the dirt with the point of his sword. "We strike hard and fast," he said, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the murmurs. "Archers first, we drive their defenders from the walls. Then the shield wall moves forward, covering the men with the ram." He looked at Thorvald. "You," Stenvar ordered, "will stay close to the ram. If it breaks, you fix it. If it burns, you douse it. You keep us moving forward, blacksmith." Thorvald nodded slowly, his throat tight. He'd imagined swinging a blade, not repairing wooden siege tools under a rain of arrows, but he said nothing. The horn sounded. The warriors surged forward in a dark wave, shields raised high as their boots pounded the frozen earth. Archers loosed the first volley. Arrows arced through the pale sky, darkening it for a heartbeat before clattering against the palisade. From the walls, the defenders answered with their own rain of death. Arrows hissed like angry serpents, striking shields, splitting wood, and finding gaps in armor. One man beside Thorvald cried out, clutching his throat as he collapsed into the frost-hardened grass. Thorvald clenched his jaw and pressed forward behind the ram, a heavy oak trunk wrapped in wet hides, carried on the shoulders of 10 men. His arms strained as he pushed, boots digging deep into the frozen mud. "Keep moving," Einar roared from somewhere ahead. "Push!" From the battlements, defenders hurled clay pots filled with burning pitch. One smashed against a shield in front of Thorvald, spraying fire across the ram. "Water!" someone bellowed, and Thorvald grabbed a bucket, dousing the flames as smoke seared his throat. His eyes stung, but he forced his hands steady, hammering iron bands back into place where the heat had warped the frame. The gate loomed ahead now, close enough to see the grain of the oak planks, scarred and blackened from years of battle. Thorvald slammed his shoulder into the ram alongside the others. "Again!" shouted Einar. "Hit it like Thor's hammer." The great trunk struck the gate with a deep, booming crack. Wood splintered, dust spilling from between the beams. "Again! Again!" Each strike echoed like thunder through the valley, matched by the screams from above and the pounding of drums behind them. A sudden shout rose from the left flank, and Thorvald turned to see defenders rushing out through a smaller side gate. Dozens of them, wielding spears and short swords, smashing into the Vikings' unprepared side. "Hold the line," Stenvar roared, his crimson cloak flashing in the chaos as he drew his massive blade. The Viking warriors surged to meet the charge, shields slamming, axes flashing in arcs of sunlight and blood. Thorvald grabbed his axe and stepped into the fray, his breath ragged, muscles burning as he blocked a downward strike and countered with a brutal hook into the man's ribs. He pivoted sharply, using his shield to deflect another blow, the impact jarring his shoulder to the bone. All around him, steel rang against steel, men screamed, and the earth became slick beneath his boots. The smell of blood, sweat, and burning pitch filled his nostrils until it choked him. Then, with a deafening crack, the main gates burst inward. The ram smashed through the weakened wood, and the Jarl's war cry tore through the din. Inside, take it all! The warriors surged into Eldhalo, fanning out through the narrow streets as defenders retreated toward the central hall. Arrows still flew from windows and alleys, but the weight of numbers drove the locals back step by step. Thorvald followed Einar through the chaos, his axe rising and falling in a blur of motion, though his mind had begun to detach from the killing, moving on instinct alone. He caught glimpses as they advanced, a woman pulling her children into a cellar, a dog barking wildly before vanishing into smoke, a toppled cart spilling apples into the mud, crushed beneath trampling boots. It didn't last long. By late afternoon, the last defenders fell. Fires burned along the western side of the settlement, black smoke rising in choking columns. The cries of the wounded mixed with the eerie silence of the dead, their forms sprawled among shattered shields and splintered spears. Thorvald stood in the central square, leaning heavily on his axe, chest heaving, sweat soaking his tunic beneath the leather armor. His arms shook from exhaustion, and his throat was raw from smoke and shouting. Einar approached, wiping blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. "You fought like a berserker," he said, offering a weary grin. Thorvald shook his head slowly, his voice low. "I fought to live." Jarl Stenvar raised his bloodied sword high, his voice carrying over the weary, battered warriors. "Eldhalo is ours." Cheers rose, ragged, hoarse but fierce. But Thorvald didn't cheer. He stared at his hands, trembling still, stained dark with blood that wasn't his. Around him, fires crackled and the blackened air tasted like iron and ash. The forge had always been his world, a place of creation, of shaping order from chaos. Now, standing in the ruins of Eldhalo, he felt as though he'd become the very chaos he once tamed. The fires of Eldhalo still burned long after sunset. Thick columns of black smoke drifted into the night sky, blotting out the pale moon and stars. The air was heavy with the stench of ash, blood, and wet earth, and the cries of ravens echoed from the surrounding woods, sharp and mocking. Thorvald sat on the wide stone steps outside the central hall, his axe resting across his knees, his hands blackened with soot and blood. His leather armor was torn and damp, the weight of the day's battle still pressing on his shoulders like a millstone. The warmth of the forge, the steady rhythm of hammer on steel, it felt like another life entirely. Inside the hall, the victory feast was beginning. Outside, the ghosts of the dead still walked the streets. Inside the central hall, Jarl Stenvar presided over the division of the loot. The heavy oak tables groaned under the weight of silver cups, gold arm rings, furs, and finely wrought weapons taken from the fallen. The warriors gathered around, their faces lit by torchlight, sweat and blood streaking their skin. "By the gods and by blood," the Jarl declared, "we share what we have claimed." The first picks went to Stenvar's sworn men, those who had stood closest to the gates when the ram broke through. Einar received a silver-inlaid sword, its hilt wrapped in dyed leather. Halfdan claimed a gold clasp shaped like a serpent. When Thorvald's name was called, he stepped forward slowly. The Jarl placed a heavy pouch of silver coins in his palm. "You've earned this, blacksmith," Stenvar said with rare softness. "Your steel opened these gates." Thorvald nodded silently, then stepped back, tucking the pouch into his belt. But murmurs rippled through the crowd, voices low, sharp with envy. Not everyone agreed with the Jarl's generosity. Later, outside the hall, the sounds of celebration carried into the streets, clattering horns, booming songs, and laughter thick with mead. Yet beneath the revelry, tension grew. Near the fires, two warriors argued fiercely over a gold-plated shield. Others whispered that Stenvar kept the finest treasures for himself and his chosen men. Voices rose, curses flew, and knives flashed briefly in the torchlight before Halfdan shoved the rivals apart with a barked warning. Einar approached Thorvald, handing him a horn of mead. "Trouble's brewing," he muttered, his voice low. "Some men think Stenvar's favoring his own blood." Thorvald sipped the drink, his throat dry. Does it matter? Einar's jaw tightened. It always matters. Men fight for silver as much as for honor. Without both, oaths break. Thorvald glanced back toward the longships, their dragon heads silhouetted against the burning horizon. A strange unease stirred in his gut. By midnight, the central square roared with music and song. Warriors danced around great bonfires, stamping their boots in time with pounding drums, while others wrestled, shouted, or lay sprawled drunk in the mud. The Gothic priests moved silently among them, scattering drops of blood wine into the fire, whispering prayers to Odin, Thor, and Freyja for guidance and glory. They tossed bundles of herbs onto the flames, sending spirals of fragrant smoke into the dark, and intoned softly, "Blood feeds the earth, steel feeds the soul, glory feeds the halls of the slain." Thorvald stood on the edges of the gathering, watching with cold detachment. Every shout, every laugh, every splash of mead across the firelit dirt seemed muffled, distant. "Drink, Thorvald," someone called, thrusting a horn into his hand. He shook his head and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. He wandered to the outskirts of the settlement, where a small, dying fire still smoldered among the ruins of a burned hut. Sitting cross-legged on the cold ground, Thorvald stared into the embers until they blurred, the glowing shapes twisting and writhing into strange, fleeting forms. The crackle of the fire faded. The world around him slowed, and then he saw them, ravens, dozens of them, their black wings blotting out the faint moonlight. They wheeled silently above the ruins before spiraling downward into the flames, vanishing into smoke and shadow. A voice came with them, low and distant, like an echo pulled from deep within the earth. "Iron Hand, your path is chosen, but not by you." Thorvald jerked upright, his heart pounding, sweat cooling against his neck. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Only the cold wind whistling through broken walls and the restless creak of smoldering timber. Later, he returned to the longship where his gear was stored, curling into his cloak on the damp earth. Around him, the camp still roared with drunken celebration, but he heard none of it. His breath came slow and shallow as exhaustion finally dragged him under. Sleep did not bring peace. He dreamed of the forge, but the steel he shaped dripped red, hissing and steaming on the anvil. Every blade he hammered became a screaming mouth, every shield a broken skull. Above him, the ravens circled endlessly, their calls sharp and unyielding. When he woke, the first gray light of dawn stretched across the horizon, and his chest was damp with cold sweat. Einar crouched beside him, tightening the straps of his armor. "You look like you've seen hell herself," he said quietly. Thorvald stared at his blood-stained hands, his voice rough. "Maybe I have." As the sun rose over the smoking ruins of Eldhalo, the warriors prepared to march again. Scouts reported another stronghold 2 days to the south, larger, richer, better defended. Jarl Stenvar raised his sword, its blade catching the new light. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice ringing across the camp. "The south will break before us." Cheers erupted, but Thorvald said nothing. His gaze drifted east, where 2 ravens perched silently on a charred post, watching him with unblinking black eyes. The forge was far behind him now, and so was the man he had been. The sky hung low and heavy, swollen with clouds the color of forged iron. A cold wind swept through the marching warriors, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant river water. The beaten path wound between rolling hills, slick with frost and spotted with dark pines clinging stubbornly to the earth. It had been 2 days since Eldhalo burned. 2 days of silent marching, broken only by the creak of leather, the muffled thud of boots, and the occasional call of a raven circling above. Thorvald walked near the center of the column, his round shield strapped to his back, the haft of his axe resting across his shoulder. Einar walked beside him, silent for once, chewing a strip of dried meat as his gaze swept the horizon. Ahead of them, scouts darted like shadows between the hills, returning now and then with curt reports. And on the 3rd morning they brought word: "Frostmere lies ahead." The ridge fell away to reveal a wide valley, at the heart of which lay a sprawling settlement. Frostmere, an old trading town built where two rivers met, their waters merging into a broad channel glittering faintly beneath the dull gray sky. Wooden palisades rose high around the town, reinforced with stone at the base, and a wide ditch carved deep into the earth encircled the outer wall. Watchtowers bristled along the perimeter, and banners depicting a white stag snapped in the biting wind. Beyond the gates, Thorvald could see the faint outlines of market stalls, the angled roofs of storehouses, and the smoke of cooking fires twisting into the clouds. But it was the movement beyond the walls that caught his attention. Riders, dozens of them, mounted on powerful horses, patrolling the open fields beyond the settlement. Einar spat into the dirt. "Mounted warriors," he muttered. "That's new." Thorvald frowned, tightening his grip on his shield strap. "Then we'll bleed before we breach those walls." Jarl Stenvar stood atop the ridge, his crimson cloak snapping in the cold wind. He planted his sword into the frozen earth and addressed the gathered warriors. "Frostmere is rich," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Silver flows through its gates, guarded by men who think walls make them safe. We'll show them otherwise." He gestured toward the mounted patrols. "Their riders are fast but few. We lure them into the hills, break their formation, then strike the gates before the rest can rally." Halfdan scowled beneath his graying beard. "And if they don't bite, then we burn their fields," Stenvar said simply, his tone as cold as the wind. "Smoke will bring them out." The trap was set before noon. A small band of Vikings, Einar among them, moved into the open field, making no effort to hide. It didn't take long for the mounted patrols to react. Thorvald crouched among the trees at the edge of the hills, watching as the riders spurred their horses forward, shields raised, spears lowered. Their war cries carried over the valley like the scream of hawks. When they reached the narrow gorge, Stenvar's horn sounded. Arrows rained from the ridges, thudding into the riders' shields, felling horses mid-gallop. The survivors tried to turn, but the narrow path trapped them, forcing them into the waiting shield wall below. Einar roared as he leapt forward, his axe cleaving through the first rider's leg. Thorvald followed, driving his seeks into the thigh of another as the man toppled from his saddle. Horses screamed, hooves tearing at the frozen ground, but within minutes the skirmish was over. The field lay silent but for the labored breaths of the victors. By dusk, dark clouds gathered thick over the valley. The first drops of cold rain struck Thorvald's shoulders as the Vikings formed ranks before the ditch surrounding Frostmere's walls. The sound of the storm built steadily, until it drowned the distant shouts from the defenders atop the palisade. "Shields up!" Stenvar barked as arrows hissed through the downpour, striking harmlessly against raised wood. Thorvald pushed forward behind the ram once again, water streaming down his face, soaking his tunic and chilling him to the bone. The wet hides wrapped around the ram steamed where torches landed, but he and two others doused every spark before it could spread. Einar pressed close, grinning despite the rain. "You wanted to fight, blacksmith," he shouted over the storm. "Here it is." Thorvald grunted, driving his shoulder into the ram. "I wanted steel," he muttered. "Not this." The gates held longer than anyone expected. Arrow fire from the walls slowed the advance, and boiling pitch poured down on the shield wall, forcing men to break formation and scatter. The screams of the burned cut through the roar of rain and thunder, raw and piercing. At last, after the 10th strike, the gates shuddered and cracked. A final heave sent the massive timbers splitting inward with a deafening groan. The Vikings surged forward, spilling into Frostmere like a tide of iron and fire. Inside the walls, the defenders fought like cornered wolves. Narrow streets channeled the warriors into bottlenecks where spears and arrows found easy targets. The clash of steel echoed between the wooden houses, and the rain turned the packed earth into slick black mud. Thorvald fought back to back with Einar, his axe rising and falling in brutal rhythm, his muscles aching with every swing. But in the chaos, he saw Halfdan fall. An arrow punched through the old warrior's throat, and he dropped silently into the mud, his sword slipping from his hand. Thorvald froze for half a heartbeat, his breath catching in his chest. Then Einar dragged him forward with a savage shove. "Keep moving, we avenge him later." When the last defender fell, Frostmere was theirs, but Thorvald did not cheer. He stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, staring at Halfdan's lifeless form among the fallen. The price of victory had been paid in blood, and for the first time Thorvald wondered if the silver was worth it. The storm had passed, but the rain had left its mark. Pools of dark water filled the ruts and footprints across the battlefield, reflecting the cold, gray sky. Broken spears jutted from the mud like the ribs of some long-dead beast, and the air was thick with the sharp tang of blood, wet earth, and burned wood. Thorvald stood among the fallen, his boots sinking into the sodden ground, staring down at Halfdan's body. The old warrior lay where he had fallen, his pale eyes still open, staring blankly at the heavens. Thorvald knelt, closing them gently with his rough, soot-blackened fingers. "You deserved better," he whispered. His voice cracked, barely audible above the sound of ravens circling overhead. By midday, the dead had been gathered into a long row outside the walls of Frostmere. Some were laid carefully on shields, their weapons placed across their chests. Others, too broken for ceremony, were wrapped in furs or straw mats. The rain-soaked earth had swallowed too much blood to dig graves quickly, so pyres were built instead. Thorvald helped stack the wood with his bare hands, his muscles aching from exhaustion but refusing to rest. Beside him, Einar worked in silence, his jaw tight, his face pale beneath the streaks of soot and blood. When the pyres were ready, the Gothite priests stepped forward, their white-ash-painted faces solemn beneath their hooded cloaks. They raised their hands toward the gray sky and began to chant, low and deep, their voices weaving an ancient hymn older than memory. Flames carry the fallen, smoke guides their souls, steel sleeps in Valhalla, and the gods drink deep of their glory. The first torch was lit, and fire spread quickly, consuming wood, flesh, and steel alike. Thick black smoke curled upward, twisting into the wind. The air filled with the bitter scent of burning pine, oil, and flesh, a smell Thorvald knew he would never forget. Ravens gathered on the walls above, dozens of them, silent and watchful. One tilted its head as the fire crackled and hissed below, its black eyes catching the faint light. That night, Jarl Stenvar gathered his warriors in Frostmere's central hall. The long room smelled of damp wood and smoke, the torches casting unsteady shadows across carved beams and battered shields. The victory feast was subdued. Horns of mead passed from hand to hand, but voices were low, laughter scarce. Loss hung heavy in the air, settling between the warriors like a shadow none dared name. When the spoils were brought forth, tension sharpened. "You keep too much for yourself, Stenvar," one man growled, standing with his fists clenched. "We bled for this silver too." The hall fell silent. The Jarl rose slowly, his crimson cloak pooling at his feet. His voice was quiet but edged like steel. "Without me, you'd have bled and gained nothing. Do you doubt my right to lead?" The man hesitated, then sat without a word. But the murmurs began again, low and dangerous, like distant thunder rolling over the hills. Einar leaned toward Thorvald, whispering beneath the noise. "Fractures, you see it, don't you? Every raid brings us silver and more cracks in the shield wall." Thorvald nodded faintly, saying nothing. His gaze drifted to the flickering fire, where shadows danced like restless spirits. Unable to sleep, Thorvald wandered out into the cold night. The fires of the burial pyres still smoldered beyond the walls, their embers glowing faintly like dying stars scattered across the earth. He sat near one of the blackened mounds, staring at the ash as it drifted on the wind. His thoughts tangled like roots, memories of the forge, the smell of hot iron, the hammer's song, mingling with the screams of dying men and the roar of battle. And then, once again, the ravens came. Two of them descended silently from the dark sky, landing atop a charred spear haft protruding from the ashes. They watched him, unmoving, their black feathers shining faintly in the torchlight. Thorvald blinked, and suddenly the world shifted. The fire burned brighter, and within it he saw visions, shapes and shadows, steel and blood. endless halls filled with warriors beneath golden light. Above them stood a figure cloaked in ravens, its single eye glowing like molten gold. A voice echoed, deep and resonant, filling the night. Iron Hand, the path you walk leads to fire, steel forged in blood or broken in shadow. Thorvald gasped and staggered back, clutching at the damp earth. The vision shattered, leaving only smoke and silence. The ravens were gone. He didn't notice Einar approach until a hand rested firmly on his shoulder. "You're shaking," Einar said softly, crouching beside him. "What did you see?" Thorvald hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing." Einar's eyes searched his face for a long moment before he nodded slowly. "Then hold to that. Whatever visions the gods send, they're rarely gentle." Thorvald exhaled shakily, staring into the cold ashes at his feet. When morning came, the air was sharp and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and charred wood. The warriors prepared to march again, but now they were fewer. The shield wall that had seemed unbreakable at Eldhalo was thinner here, faces missing where brothers had once stood. Jarl Stenvar addressed them from the steps of the hall, his voice hard as forged iron. "Two more strongholds lie ahead," he said. "The land will break beneath us, or we'll break upon it. There is no other fate." The warriors cheered faintly, but Thorvald remained silent, his eyes drawn to the two ravens perched high on the ruined gates. They stared at him, unblinking, waiting. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and distant smoke as the warriors crested the final ridge. Beyond it lay Skavholm, the largest settlement they had yet seen, a bustling market town built where the river forked into two wide channels. Even from the hilltop, Thorvald could see the walls, towering oak palisades reinforced with stone at the base, lined with watchtowers bristling with spears. Banners depicting a white stag flapped violently in the biting wind, snapping like whips. Beyond the gates, rooftops clustered tightly together, and thin trails of smoke curled lazily into the gray sky. But it was not the town itself that drew Thorvald's breath short. It was the army outside it. Rows upon rows of defenders stood ready in the open field before the gates. Shields locked, spears angled forward, banners whipping above them. Behind them, on the ramparts, catapults were being readied, their arms creaking as crews wound them tight. Riders on powerful horses moved restlessly at the flanks, their polished armor glinting faintly under the muted sun. Einar stood beside Thorvald, silent for a moment, then muttered low. "Skavholm won't fall easily." Thorvald said nothing. The weight of what lay ahead pressed on him like the hammer's swing, inevitable, final. Jarl Stenvar gathered his captains near the ridge, crouched over a rough map scratched into wet earth. His crimson cloak clung damply to his mail, rain dripping steadily from its frayed hem. "We take them in 3 waves, the Jarl said, his voice low but sharp. "Archers harass their lines, shield wall drives the center, and the flanks push wide to cut off their retreat." Halfdan's absence was painfully felt. His second, a grim man named Kagel, nodded curtly. "And the catapults," Stenvar's lips tightened. "We endure them." Thorvald's stomach turned. He had faced arrows, axes, fire, but the thought of stones the size of barrels smashing through shield and bone alike sent a cold shiver crawling down his spine. By midday, dark clouds rolled over the valley, and a fine, cold rain began to fall, soaking leather, mail, and cloaks alike. The ground softened underfoot, the trampled grass turning slowly to slick black mud. The Jarl's horn sounded low, deep, and mournful. The Vikings advanced. Thorvald gripped his shield, its wet rim slippery beneath his calloused fingers. To his left, Einar carried his heavy axe, jaw set, eyes fixed ahead. Around them, 50 men breathed as one, boots squelching in the mud, their movements slow, deliberate, measured. Across the field, drums began to beat. Deep, rolling thunder that echoed off the walls of Skavholm, carrying a promise of death. The first volley came screaming from the ramparts, arrows darkening the sky, their hiss drowned by the roar of shields locking into place. Wood splintered, men shouted, and somewhere nearby someone fell with a sharp, choking cry. Then came the catapults. The first stone struck the ground just ahead of Thorvald, sending mud and shattered shields into the air. The second slammed into the shield wall itself, breaking 3 men instantly, their bodies tumbling lifeless into the churned earth. "Forward!" Stenvar roared, his crimson cloak snapping wildly in the rain. "Close the distance!" Thorvald's boots slipped in the mud as he pressed closer, the pounding of his heart loud in his ears. The shield wall surged ahead, advancing step by brutal step until they slammed into the defenders' line. The impact was like thunder. Shields crashed, spears thrust, and swords screamed against steel. Thorvald swung his axe in short, savage arcs, feeling the shudder as it bit into wood, leather, flesh. Einar roared beside him, his heavy axe cleaving a defender's shield in two before taking the man down in a single blow. The rain washed the blood from their arms, but not fast enough. For a time, the lines held. Then the riders came. From the flanks, Skavholm's cavalry swept into the mud-soaked field, their horses kicking up black water as they crashed into the Vikings' outer ranks. Spears pierced shields, trampling hooves crushed limbs, and chaos erupted among the rear lines. Kjell bellowed orders, rallying a dozen men to form a hedgehog formation, spears angled outward. The first wave of riders fell screaming, impaled on ashwood shafts, but more circled around, regrouping for another charge. Thorvald pivoted hard, his boots sinking ankle-deep in the muck as he pulled a fallen spear from the ground and drove it into a rider's chest, wrenching it free just in time to block another blade. Einar fought at his side, his cloak torn, his face streaked with blood and rain. "This isn't a battle," he shouted over the din. "It's slaughter." Thorvald spat mud from his mouth, his jaw clenched tight. "Then we survive it." By late afternoon, the rain had turned to a steady downpour, and the field was a mire of churned mud and bodies. The defenders fell back slowly, retreating toward the gates, but the cost was staggering. Dozens of Vikings lay dead, and many more limped or bled heavily. In the chaos, some began shouting to retreat, voices sharp with fear, breaking against the steady rhythm of war drums. Stenvar wheeled on them, his blade dripping red, his voice thunderous even over the storm. "Any man who turns his back dies where he stands." But the murmurs grew louder, anger mixing with exhaustion. Some accused the Jarl of pushing them too far for too little reward. A few even lowered their shields, stepping back into the churned mud as arguments broke out in the middle of battle. Thorvald saw it, the first cracks in the oath-bound brotherhood, like hairline fractures spreading through a blade under too much strain. At last, with one final push, the Vikings breached Skavholm's outer defenses. The gates splintered under the ram, and warriors poured into the narrow streets, where fighting turned vicious and close. Blood mixed with rainwater, running in thin crimson rivers through the gutters. Torches hissed and sputtered against the downpour, smoke mingling with mist to cloak the chaos in choking gray. Thorvald drove his axe into a defender's chest, twisting it free just as another lunged. His shield caught the blow, but the impact knocked him into the wall, the air punched from his lungs. He staggered, gasping, forcing himself back into the fight by sheer will. Einar's roar carried over the clamor as he dragged a wounded man to safety, his strength never faltering even as his arms trembled with exhaustion. By nightfall, Skavholm was theirs. The defenders lay scattered among the streets, their weapons broken, their banners fallen into the mud. The rain washed much of the blood away, but the stench of death clung thick in the damp air. Thorvald leaned against the shattered gate, chest heaving, his arms limp at his sides. Around him, the Vikings stumbled through the wreckage, their cheers muted, their faces pale beneath streaks of dirt and blood. Einar limped toward him, one arm hanging uselessly at his side, his breath ragged. "Too many," he rasped. "We've lost too many." Thorvald said nothing. His gaze drifted to the Jarl, who stood tall atop the steps of the town square, his crimson cloak soaked dark and heavy in the rain. Stenvar raised his sword, but this time, fewer voices answered his cry of victory. The rain had stopped, but the streets of Skavholm still glistened black beneath the pale morning light. Pools of red-stained water gathered between the cobblestones, reflecting the jagged silhouettes of toppled banners and broken shields. The cries of the wounded rose faintly from alleyways, blending with the harsh cawing of ravens perched along the shattered rooftops. Thorvald walked through the silent streets, his boots splashing through thin rivulets of blood and rainwater. His body ached with every step, his leather armor stiff from dried gore, and yet his mind was louder than his wounds. The hammer's song no longer echoed in his thoughts. Now there was only steel, screams, and fire. Inside the central square, Jarl Stenvar stood atop the stone steps of the great hall, his crimson cloak hanging heavy and soaked from the night's storm. Around him, warriors gathered in tense, shifting clusters. The Jarl's voice carried over the square, sharp as a drawn blade. "Skavholm is ours. We bled for it and the gods favor us. But we march again soon. There are richer lands beyond these rivers." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, low at first but growing like distant thunder. A tall warrior stepped forward, Sauron, a man known for his strength and his temper. "March again," he snarled, his voice raw. "Half our brothers lie dead in the mud, and you speak of more battles." Stenvar's gaze locked on him, cold and unyielding. "The living honor the dead by taking what they could not. Do you question my right to lead?" Sauron spat onto the cobblestones. "I question whether you lead us to silver or to our graves." The square erupted in shouts. Some roared their loyalty to the Jarl, others cursed his name, fists clenching around weapon hafts. Thorvald stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as the oath-bound brotherhood splintered before his eyes. Einar stepped close, whispering under his breath, "This won't hold much longer. One more raid, one mistake, and steel will turn on steel." Thorvald's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That evening, the spoils of Skavholm were laid out across the great hall's tables. Piles of silver coins, bolts of fine cloth, carved figurines, and barrels of salted fish. Torches burned low, their flames twisting in the draught as warriors gathered for the division. Stenvar distributed the riches according to rank, giving the largest shares to his sworn men and those who had led the assault on the gates. But when lesser warriors received scraps, a single silver cup, a handful of coins, tempers flared. "You keep the fat for yourself," one man shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. "Half my kin lie dead, and this is my reward," another spat. "We are no longer warriors, we are slaves to your greed." Steel hissed from its sheath before Stenvar's roar silenced the hall. "Any man who draws steel against me dies before dawn." But the silence that followed was not loyalty, it was hatred, cold and heavy as winter ice. Thorvald exchanged a glance with Einar across the room. For the first time, he saw something dangerous in his friend's eyes: doubt. That night, Thorvald could not sleep. He sat alone in one of Skavholm's abandoned forges, staring into the dead embers of a cold hearth. His hands moved without thought, tracing the shape of a hammer from memory, feeling its weight though none was there. The silence deepened, and then the ravens came again. Dozens of them, silent and watchful, their black feathers shimmering faintly in the torchlight outside the forge's window. They lined the rooftops and broken beams, their unblinking eyes fixed upon him. Thorvald blinked once and the world shifted. The forge roared to life, heat washing over him. The iron on the anvil glowed bright as blood, and within the molten steel he saw shapes forming, twisting shadows of warriors locked in endless battle, their screams lost to the roar of fire. Above them towered a figure cloaked in feathers, a single golden eye burning through the smoke. "Iron Hand," the voice whispered, deep as the earth and cold as the grave. "The forge shapes all things, even men. Steel that bends survives. Steel that breaks is forgotten." Thorvald gasped and stumbled back, blinking hard. The forge was dark again, silent and cold, but the ravens remained, watching, waiting. The next morning, Einar found Thorvald sitting outside the forge, his face pale, his hands trembling. "You didn't sleep," Einar said, lowering himself beside him. Thorvald shook his head slowly. "I dreamt, or maybe I didn't." Einar studied him carefully, then leaned close. "Listen to me, blacksmith. Stenvar's leading us to ruin. Men are already talking, some plan to leave before the next march." Thorvald frowned. Desertion. Call it survival, Einar said flatly. If we stay, we'll die here or on the next field. Thorvald stared at the ground, silent. For years his path had been clear. Forge the steel, shape the blade, arm the warrior. But now his hammer was useless, and his blade was wet with blood he could never wash away. The gods had given him strength, but they had not given him answers. By dusk, a storm gathered over Skavholm once more. The winds howled through the streets, rattling broken shutters and carrying the sharp caw of ravens across the rooftops. In the great hall, Stenvar spoke of another raid, a settlement deeper inland, richer than all the rest combined. His voice thundered, but fewer warriors answered this time. Soren stood again, his hand on his sword. "We march no further," he said. "We bury our dead. We go home." Steel rasped as half a dozen blades slid free in response. Thorvald stepped back into the shadows, his heart pounding. He realized then that the next battle would not be against walls or gates. It would be Vikings against Vikings. The air above Skavholm was restless, thick with the smoke of dying fires and the sharp, metallic scent of wet iron. Dark clouds churned over the rooftops, swallowing the fading light of day and painting the streets in deep gray shadows. Thorvald stood in the central square, leaning on the haft of his axe, watching as warriors gathered in small, tense knots. Their voices were low, sharp, and dangerous, carrying none of the brotherhood they once shared. The shield wall that had faced countless enemies together now fractured, cracks spidering through its very heart. Some looked to Jarl Stenvar, his crimson cloak bright even in the gloom, a beacon of unbending strength. Others drifted toward Einar and Soren, who stood at the edge of the square, speaking quietly with a growing circle of men. The forge within Thorvald's soul burned low and cold. Every oath he'd sworn was being tested. That night tension thickened like frost on steel. In the great hall, warriors sat along the benches in silence, drinking without laughter, their gazes avoiding one another. The only sound was the crackle of the central fire and the slow drip of water from a hole in the roof where rain had leaked through. Soren rose suddenly, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. "No more," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Half our brothers rot beneath the walls, and the Jarl speaks only of silver and blood. We march to die for his pride, not the gods." A murmur rippled through the hall, agreement from some, curses from others. Stenvar rose slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the benches. His voice was calm but edged with tempered steel. "I lead because I must. You follow because you swore. Break your oath, and you break the bond that makes us strong." Einar stood beside Soren, his hand resting on his axe. "We swore to stand as brothers," he said evenly. "But brothers do not lead each other into the grave without cause." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Torches hissed in the damp air. Fingers tightened on weapon hilts. One wrong word, one sharp breath, and steel would be drawn. Then, abruptly, Stenvar turned and left the hall without another word. Later that night, Thorvald found himself drawn to a narrow alley behind the longhouse, where Einar and a handful of trusted men gathered in the shadows. The flicker of a single lantern lit their tense faces as the rain whispered softly against the rooftops. "There's no future under Stenvar," Einar said, his voice low but steady. "He'll march us until we break. We leave before the next raid those who come with us live. Those who stay die for his ambition." Soren spat into the dirt. "We'll need ships, supplies, and steel." "You'll have steel," Thorvald said quietly from the darkness. The men turned to him, surprised at his sudden voice. Thorvald stepped forward, his broad shoulders haloed by the faint glow of the lantern. "If we do this," he said, "there's no going back." Einar met his gaze, unwavering. "We passed that point long ago." Thorvald hesitated, his breath misting in the cold air. He thought of his forge, of the fire he'd once controlled, and how his life now felt like steel shaped by hands not his own. That night sleep eluded him. Thorvald wandered beyond the walls of Skavholm, climbing a small hill where the blackened remnants of the burial pyre still lay. The air there was sharp and cold, carrying the faint tang of old smoke and death. He knelt beside the ashes, his rough hand sifting through blackened embers as a cold wind whipped across the hilltop. And then came the ravens. Two of them descended from the storm clouds above, their wings slicing the silence as they landed on the charred remains of a spear haft, their black eyes fixed on Thorvald, unblinking. The world blurred. The ashes before him glowed faintly, embers rekindling into a vision, a vast hall beneath a sky of shifting lights, its roof made of shields, its walls of woven spears. There, seated upon a throne of wolf pelts and feathers, was a figure cloaked in darkness. One eye burned bright as gold, the other was lost to shadow. Iron Hand, the voice rolled like distant thunder, deep and terrible. Two paths lie before you. Follow blood and you'll be forged in fire. Follow oath and you'll be broken. Choose or the choice will be made for you. Thorvald's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling as the vision dissolved back into cold, empty night. The ravens were gone. By dawn, Thorvald returned to the longhouse. His cloak was soaked, his boots caked in mud, and his mind burned with the words of the unseen god. Inside, Einar waited. "You've seen something," he said quietly, studying Thorvald's pale face. Thorvald nodded slowly but said nothing. Einar placed a hand on his shoulder, gripping it tightly. "Stenvar will march tomorrow," he said. "If we're going to break from him, we do it before the next blood spills." Thorvald looked past him, toward the far-off forge where his tools lay untouched, silent as a grave. The hammer had always shaped the steel, but now the steel was shaping him. That night, the camp slept uneasily beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds. Torches burned low along the walls, their flames flickering in the wind. The ravens returned, circling above Skavholm in restless silence, their cries sharp and unsettling. Thorvald sat awake beside the embers of a dying fire, his axe across his knees, listening to the distant crash of waves against the riverbanks. Tomorrow choices would be made. Tomorrow brothers would raise steel against brothers. Tomorrow the oath would shatter, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning came with no song of birds, only the hollow wail of the wind through the shattered gates of Skavholm. A cold mist hung low over the square, curling like restless spirits around broken shields and toppled banners. Thorvald stood at the edge of the camp, his hands resting on the haft of his axe, staring into the gray void beyond the walls. Today, the oath would break. Today, steel would drink the blood of brothers. The warriors assembled in the central square, their faces pale beneath streaks of soot and dried blood. No drums thundered this time, no songs rose to the gods. Only silence stretched between two groups, Stenvar's loyalists on one side, Einar and Sorin's rebels on the other. Between them lay a thin strip of damp earth, churned by yesterday's boots, where blood had already dried black. Jarl Stenvar stood tall, his crimson cloak snapping in the icy wind, his sword resting on his shoulder. His gaze swept the rebels like a drawn blade. "You swore to follow me," he said, his voice deep, calm, dangerous. "You swore before the gods, before your kin, before the fire." Sorin stepped forward from Einar's side, his jaw clenched, his hand resting on his axe. "We swore to fight for honor," he spat, "not for your pride. You've led us from fire to fire, burning men into ash for silver we'll never see." Murmurs rippled through the ranks. Some men shifted nervously, eyes darting between the two leaders. Others clenched their shields tighter, ready for what they all knew was coming. Thorvald stood at the center, his chest heavy with the weight of his choice. Einar's gaze burned into him from one side, Stenvar's from the other. The silence broke like ice cracking underfoot. A single blade hissed from its sheath, followed by another and another. Shields lifted. Then Stenvar's roar tore through the air like a storm wind. "Traitors die!" The two forces collided with the scream of steel against steel, the sound echoing through the streets of Skavholm. The first clash was brutal, close and raw, no tactics, no formations, just men tearing at each other with everything they had left. Thorvald swung his axe high, blocking a downward strike before hooking his blade into the rim of a shield and wrenching it away. Mud splashed beneath his boots as he shoved the man back, only to meet another blow from the side. Einar fought like a storm beside him, his heavy axe carving through mail and leather, his roar rising above the chaos. For the first time, Thorvald wasn't fighting strangers. Every face he saw, he knew. The battle churned through the narrow streets, spilling into alleys where blood mixed with rainwater and pooled beneath fallen banners. Thorvald saw Soren cleave through two men before a spear struck him clean through the chest. The rebel leader staggered, gasped once and fell to his knees, his lifeblood soaking the black earth. A scream tore from Einar's throat, and he lunged forward, cutting down the spear wielder in a single vicious stroke. Thorvald grabbed his friend's arm, pulling him back as arrows hissed from above. "Not here," he shouted. "Not like this." But Einar's face was pale, his eyes dark with fury and grief. Soren had been his closest brother, and now he lay motionless in the mud. As the fighting raged, the sky darkened unnaturally. Thick clouds rolled overhead, swallowing the pale light until the square lay beneath a shifting veil of shadow. And then came the ravens. Dozens, then hundreds circling above, their cries sharp and harsh, drowning out the clash of steel. Thorvald stumbled back, breath ragged, as two of them descended, black feathers catching the faint glow of torches. The world blurred. In the midst of battle, Thorvald stood once more within the golden hall of his visions. Its shield-lined walls trembled as a figure stepped forward from the shadows, cloaked in feathers, crowned in silence. A single golden eye burned beneath the hood. "Iron Hand," the voice shook the marrow in his bones. "You stand at the forge of fate. Two blades are before you, oath and blood. One breaks, one bends. Choose and live. Refuse and be forgotten." Thorvald gasped as the vision shattered. Around him, men screamed, steel clanged, and the ravens shrieked above. Thorvald turned, breath ragged, to find Einar standing before him, blood soaking his left arm, his axe slick and red. "Thorvald," he shouted above the din, "we can't win this. Stenvar will burn us all to ash." Behind Einar, fewer than 20 rebels still stood, pressed hard against the wall, their shields splintered, their backs nearly broken. Thorvald's gaze shifted across the square to where Stenvar fought like a man possessed, his crimson cloak torn, his blade dripping, his roar shaking the air. Around him, the loyalists rallied, their numbers still strong. If Thorvald chose Einar, they would abandon the field and flee into the unknown. If he chose Stenvar, the rebels would be slaughtered where they stood. And if he chose neither, they would all die here. Thorvald clenched his axe, his knuckles white, his breath sharp and uneven. Then, raising his voice above the screams, he bellowed, "Enough!" For a moment, impossibly, the battle slowed. Men turned, panting, weapons lowered just slightly as Thorvald stepped forward, planting himself between the two forces. He tore his helmet from his head, tossing it to the ground. "No more blood," he growled, his voice raw. "No more graves for silver, no more brothers in the mud. If the Jarl seeks more war, he'll fight it without me." Einar stared at him, chest heaving. Stenvar's jaw tightened, his golden beard matted with blood. "You'd walk away," the Jarl thundered, his voice shaking the air. Thorvald met his gaze without flinching. "I'd live." The fighting ceased. Some lowered their weapons, others stood frozen, uncertain. And then a single raven descended, landing upon the shattered gates of Skavholm. It let out one long, piercing cry, sharp enough to slice through the silence. The omen was clear. Stenvar spat into the mud, his voice cold as winter iron. "Go then, Iron Hand. Take whoever follows you." Einar stepped forward instantly, his hand on Thorvald's shoulder. One by one, others joined, scarred men, wounded men, men who had nothing left to give to a Jarl's pride. They left Skavholm together, slipping into the mist beyond the riverbanks, their footsteps vanishing into the silence of the north. Weeks later, Thorvald stood once more before his forge. The coals were cold, but the tools were where he had left them. The hammers, the tongs, the blackened anvil scarred with 1,000 strikes. His hands trembled as he touched them, feeling the weight of steel and memory. When he lit the fire, the embers came alive with a hiss and crackle, and the familiar warmth washed over him like a blessing. But the man who now stood at this forge was not the one who had left it. Behind him lay battlefields, broken oaths, and brothers lost. Before him lay only the ringing of steel and the whispers of ravens watching from the distant pines. Thorvald Ironhand had survived, but the gods were not done with him.